Hello, welcome to this video, and on this video I'm going to be looking at the life and incredible career of Keith Jarrett. This is not his 10 greatest albums. What we have here is 10 albums that sort of represent his career. They're amongst my 10 favourite albums, but I do think they do a good job of mapping out what Keith Jarrett has done in this incredible career. I am a huge Keith Jarrett fan. I have a lot of albums by Keith Jarrett, but he has made a hell of a lot of albums, and I've probably listened to probably about 25% of those albums over the years. So I'm in no position to come up with the definitive best of, but I think what we do have here is 10 albums that sort of track his career through, and anybody wishing to start a collection of Keith Jarrett, this would be a good place to start. I think you'd have a good idea after get these 10 albums of who he is and what he does. I've been doing bits of research and looking at other ranking, and I think I've picked many albums that people would put into their top 10 without a doubt. So I think these are amongst his most successful albums. I have been so worried about doing this video. This is a daunting task for me. Keith Jarrett is an incredible musician, absolutely virtuoso musician. He was born in 1945. He started playing the piano around about the age of 3 because he just seemed to have an inbuilt affinity for the piano and music. By the time I think he was about 7 years old, he was giving classical recitals. He has the sort of technique of a classical concert pianist. But then he discovered jazz, and he discovered jazz as rock and roll was emerging. So he has a collection of really interesting influences. There's a classical music influence there. There's a huge jazz influence there. You know, he is one of the great modern jazz musicians that can play jazz standards. He can play jazz standards, but he can play free jazz, Ornette Coleman style jazz. He can play fusion. He can go in all sorts of different areas, and his vast discography does. He's also a multi-instrumentalist. He's recorded so much on soprano sax, but he's also recorded all sorts of other instruments as well. This is a really interesting career, and it's daunting to try and pack all that in. I think if you were just to pick his 10 greatest albums, the problem with that, he wouldn't get into some of the nooks and crannies of his career, which are really, really interesting. So I'm going to start off with the first album on my list, which is this one. It's a double album on Rhino Records called Foundations, and it covers a lot of his early material. So Keith Jarrett emerges in the sort of mid to late 60s. He's very young at that time. His first professional gig, his first sort of internationally known recording session is actually with Art Blakey, and it's the second track on here. And it's, if I just grab the book, I wish I could remember all this, but I think it's probably from around about 1966. So he's 21 years old. It's the second track on this album, and it's My Romance. Keith Jarrett on piano, Reggie Johnson on bass, Art Blakey on drums, Chuck Mangione on trumpet, who gives a very delicate Miles Davis influenced trumpet solo on here, and Frank Mitchell on tenor sax. It's really interesting that Keith Jarrett starts off playing jazz standards. He's one of the few modern jazz musicians of the fusion era that has gone back to jazz standards continually, and has also sort of unreservedly tried to make acoustic music, right? Now the fact is, he hasn't always made acoustic music, as we will get into, and on this video I want to really make the argument of how important he is to the history of jazz fusion. So there's going to be an undercurrent of jazz fusion-ness. Well, what would you expect on this channel? Of course there will be. But here we get him with Art Blakey playing a jazz standard. The first track on here is actually Smoke Gets in Your Eyes, which is an unreleased track he made with the incredible Bob Moses. And Bob Moses is a drummer who he played with Gary Burton's band. He then crops up on the Pat Metheny's first album with Jacko. Bob Moses is an architect of jazz fusion. There was a whole bunch of musicians that were really important in the development of jazz fusion before the Mahavishnu Orchestra came along and Weather Report and Return to Forever. They're very important. And Keith Jarrett is part of that crowd. And I think one of the most important bands of the late 60s in terms of fusion is not a fusion band, but I think we have to mention them on this channel because Keith Jarrett finds his fame in that band. And that is, of course, the quartet that he had with Charles Lloyd. And that is represented on here. We've got Sorcery from, I think, which is the first album, which is called Forest Flower. We've got Love Number 3, which is from the album Journey. Oh no, that's that Journey Within, and I think that's just a solo piano piece actually. So these two tracks on here represent, especially Sorcery. So what was the Charles Lloyd Quartet about? Well, Charles Lloyd sort of emerges sort of in a sort of post Coltrane, but Coltrane packaged up for a sort of young college audience, and it's a huge hit on the college audience. I think the snobbery of the jazz critics is they don't want to admit, because this group was popular, it's almost like the 1960s Dave Brubeck Quartet, and people don't want to admit the how great this band is. But within this band we've got Cecil McBee on bass, but we've got Jack DeJohnette on drums and Keith Jarrett on piano, and these are heavyweights. And they're taking that post-Coach Coltrane way of playing and they're pushing it. And it's right on the edge of jazz fusion. They never quite commit, but a lot of the timings are quite straight. And there's a whole psychedelicness, sort of Jefferson Airplane, Grateful Dead ambience around this group. And which is what made it so popular. But of course, both of these musicians then go on to play with Miles Davis. Miles Davis spots something that's going on here. A lot of the early jazz fusion that we're looking at, pre-Bitches Brew, pre-Mahavishnu, the problem with it wasn't a success. It didn't break ground really or innovate because the albums weren't successful. This is one of the things about music, you know, to be an innovator, you have to be successful. People have to hear it, you know, not hear it at the sort of Michael Jackson Thriller level, but it has to at least have some legs, you know. And the George Lloyd Quartet has legs. This is really, really important in the establishment of Keith Jarrett, and he gets a deal. And this double album here sort of covers his own early recordings. So he's on disc 2, we see the emergence of what became known as the American Quartet. It actually starts off as the American Trio with Keith Jarrett on piano, Charlie Hayden on bass, Paul Motion on drums. And then with the addition of Dewey Redman, we have his first great quartet that makes some absolutely incredible albums. So this Anthologies album here, this really covers that early period of Keith Jarrett as he's emerging and his work as a solo musician at that point, and as a side person in various groups, most importantly Charles Lloyd's group. So the next album I've got on the list, if I can just pull my list up here, is an album specifically from that period, all right, which is this one here, a very important album in the development of jazz fusion. It's Gary Burton and Keith Jarrett together, right? This is a very important fusion album. On here we've got two jazz standards. These if you pick up any real book, you will find these tunes in the book. One is Grow Your Own and one is Como en Vietnam. At the time, this was very well received and a very important album. I think once the Mahavishnu and Weather Report and Return Forever kicked in, all this stuff gets sort of forgotten. This approach to early jazz fusion sort of goes underground and doesn't emerge later until Pat Metheny comes out with a different type of fusion. But Pat Metheny's way of approaching jazz fusion, which is much more based on chord changes, and not jazz standard chord changes, but chord changes that had come from 60s popular music like the Beatles and Simon and Garfunkel. That has its roots in a whole host of albums. I've argued this so many times that if you want one musician who we could say is the architect of jazz fusion, it's Gary Burton. He's so important to this genre, and he is Jarrett right in the midst of it, making some very, very important jazz fusion. He is actually playing electric piano and organ at this point. He has expressed the fact that he wants, he's interested in acoustic music. He's described electric pianos and organs as toys. But despite this, he takes the gig with Miles Davis. And for me, his inputs keyboard-wise on those Miles Davis albums is absolutely seminal in terms of jazz fusion. So I have to have this at number 3 on my list, which is Live Evil by Miles Davis. I've spoken about this album so often before, but Miles's foray into fusion is really interesting for me, because I think what he does on Ill and Silent Way, there's a couple of moments where Tony Williams sort of kicks into some rockish type beats, but whether this sounds anything like what we would describe as jazz fusion in the 70s, I'm not so sure. I'm pretty sure what Gary Burton, the likes of Gary Burton, Steve Marks and Larry Coryell are doing at that time is far more closer to what we would think of as jazz fusion. Bitches Brew moves closer, and obviously is influencing what Herbie Hancock's going to do with his Lamar Wandishi group, what Weather Report are going to do on the first Weather Report albums. But again, I find it difficult to class Bitches Brew as a fusion album. I think his first true fusion album would be Jack Johnson. And Jack Johnson's a really interesting thing. For me, it's gone down in history because there's moments at Jack Johnson where it's some of the greatest music ever recorded. But it's also patchy. I'm going to say it now. I haven't said it on the other bit. Jack Johnson's patchy. There's certain parts where they're floundering around for me. There's other albums that he's making with the Chick Corea, Jack DeJohnette group at that time that are actually far more powerful. But I think it was the addition of John McLaughlin, because I've been told to say his name right, to those early albums that really, he's the guy with the sort of fusion, secret, the sort of the radioactive, matter that's needed. But I think the addition of McLaughlin onto this album and Jarrett at the same time, this is really a fusion masterpiece. This album just takes your face off, right? You're not waiting around for something to happen on this album at any moment. And there's a few albums that Jarrett's on with Miles Davis, but this is the one that really shows what he was doing at that point, which is playing electric piano, like distorted, insane electric piano. It's something that is going to disappear from Jarrett's career at this point. Around about this time, he made a duo album under his own name with Jack DeJohnette. It's got a weird title. I'm sure people will put it in the comments, but go and check that album out, because there's an electric keyboard fusion album. It's very free. But there's an electric album by Keith Jarrett in his catalogue at that point. Okay, so I've hopefully managed to cover the sort of foundational aspects of Keith Jarrett's career with these 3 albums. One, of course, the Foundations, which covers a lot of it. One is the Gary Burton album. One is Miles Davis Live Evil. So I think we've got that covered. What Jarrett's doing in terms of his solo career is he's moved on to Columbia Records, and he has a group which we can call the American Quartet. I mentioned them earlier on, and they make a whole host of albums in the early to mid 70s that are absolute masterpieces. And I had a real problem trying to pick which one to represent the best of the American Quartet. And the one I've decided to go for is an album that I think is one of the greatest fusion albums ever made. And it is a fusion album. And I've never spoken about it on this channel before. So if you're a fusion fan and you haven't got this album, this is an important album to go and check out. And it is Expectations from 1972. This is a monumental album. It's one of the greatest albums from the fusion era. I've only come to this album quite recently, in the last year or so. As soon as I heard it, I knew it was great, and I've been listening to it more and more. If you go back to some of my sort of top 10 or top 20 jazz fusion lists, I think if I do these again, this album might well be getting on this list. This is an absolute masterpiece. It's that quartet, but it's augmented by Airto on percussion, and the guitarist Sam Brown, which I'm going to talk about in a minute because no one seems to have ever talked about this guy. But also on my list of albums, I haven't picked anything that puts Jarrett in an orchestral setting. He's written a lot of orchestral music, classical music. Now this album isn't that, but it's got a string section and a brass section. And what we've got in here is very free jazz fusion with a gospel sort of influence, mixing with Ornette Coleman free jazz within the context of arrangements that Keith Jarrett has written for brass and strings. And all that together, for me, gives it an almost sort of progressive rock epic element to it, which of course I love, you know. The opening track, Vision, which is 48 seconds long, I'm going to say to you right now, I think this is the greatest 48 seconds of music ever, or one of the greatest 48 seconds of music ever made. It's absolutely incredible. If you want to just hear what Jarrett's about, check off Vision of this album. Common Mama is one of the funkiest, dirtiest fusion tracks ever, and when they get to the solo they burn. Charlie Haydn on this is absolutely incredible, with this bass sound that is so full and rich and he's so exploratory, and there's moments where he sounds like Jack Bruce, but there's moments where he's so ethereal. That guy was an absolute genius. Dewey Redman is pulling in the free jazz element on this album, absolutely. And Paul Motion as a drummer seems to be able to really seriously negotiate between jazz, free jazz and fusion, and you never feel like, oh, this is a fusion drummer playing jazz, or this is a jazz drummer playing fusion. You never feel like Paul Motion seems to be sat right in the middle of that. This is the guy that played drums for Bill Evans. He is able to play sensitive, you know, acoustic jazz, but he can rock. But when he rocks, he never succumbs to what that often happens, a sort of showboating you get with jazz fusion. This is a monumental album. There's some incredible stuff on here. Sam Brown on guitar. So who the hell's Sam Brown? Well, Sam Brown sort of comes to prominence when he takes over the guitar post in the Gary Burton band, and he records important albums with Gary Burton. You know, he is a very, very important jazz fusion guitarist, a pioneer guitarist. No one mentions him. He's able to play with a distorted tone, pulling aspects of free jazz. He can rock out, he can do all the bends, but he's also can play the changes, you know, and you can hear the huge jazz knowledge behind it. I've really tried to find out what I can about him. He died in 1977. I have done a lot of research. I've been on forums trying to find out what he actually died of, and it's either a suicide or a drugs overdose or a murder, right? But the guy seems to have not ended up in a great place. A lot of the fusion musicians that dies, you know, and I think Larry Young suffers from this, I think Doug Rausch suffers from this. The ones who died in the 70s, they sort of been forgotten. But Sam Brown plays on those early Burton albums. He plays on the Liberation Orchestra album for Charlie Haydn, and he plays on this, and that should have given him a place in jazz fusion immortality. I think he plays brilliant. If I'm not careful, I am going to keep talking about this album, and I may come back and do a whole video on this album. So yeah, there's other great American Quartet albums as well by Keith Jarrett. This is not a one-off, you know. He is working on all cylinders, right? He has a deal with Columbia Records, a major label deal. He's going to get dropped at some point. You know, the Columbia decided to sign up Herbie Hancock, I think, instead. So they dropped Keith Jarrett. And if I was putting my money on someone who's going to have hit records and get in the charts with a disco hit, I would probably have put my money on Herbie Hancock as well. So he then has a concurrent deal with ECM Records. He makes his first solo jazz piano album, Facing You, around about 71, 72. I'm not too sure, actually. And he starts to work within Manfred Eicher's production model, the ECM model. Now, doing this channel and really, talking about ECM a lot. I'm a massive fan of ECM, and you'll find a video where I talk about ECM, but actually really looking into it more deeply, you start to realize that there is a certain grain to ECM's production. Sometimes they break from it, but when they break from it, you feel like the artist is stressing Manfred Eicher's production model. The ECM is a certain thing, The instances where they push against that are very, very interesting. And Keith Jarrett is a really important musician in that history, right? The next album I want to talk about, I think I'm going to actually, I was doing this chronologically, but I'm going to jump forward actually. So the next album I want to talk about is an album called Köln Concert, which I think was made in around about 75. I'm not sure. I have never owned a copy of Köln Concert, but this album, in terms of jazz history, is one of the most important albums, and it's a defining album for Keith Jarrett. It's on ECM Records. ECM Records is definitely a niche jazz, European jazz label, but the thing about the Köln Concert is it sold 4 million copies, right? I think between Pat Metheny and the Köln Concert, this has basically supported ECM Records, I would say. And it gives Jarrett a position, I think, within that label where he was allowed to do almost whatever he wants. He seemed to have loads of freedom, but within the production style of ECM, which Jarrett seems to be happy with, because he is now pursuing this exploration of acoustic jazz, and that production style, which is impeccably recorded acoustic jazz with that signature reverb sound, Jarrett can work within. The Köln Concert's an interesting album. It's a solo improvised piano album. Now, the guy that sort of really innovates this, and I've got to give a shout out, is Chick Corea with his piano improvisation albums on ECM. They're one of the early albums he makes. And I don't know whether they came first and then was a motivator for Manfred Eicher to turn around, and say to Jarrett, do you want to make a piano improvisation album? Because obviously they're relatively cheap to make, and they seem to be doing well. So he makes an album called Facing You, which is an excellent album. He follows that up with another solo piano album called Staircase. Right, and then in 75, I think it is 1975, he records the Köln Concert. This is a recording of a live gig. Now, this gig was sort of plagued with all sorts of problems. I think Jarrett arrived late. He hadn't eaten. He managed to get one mouthful of food before he went on stage. The piano was not a full grand piano; it was a baby grand piano, and the piano was not satisfactory. And Jarrett wanted to pull the gig, but he decided to do it, I think, because there was an audience there. So he sits down and he starts to improvise, but he's having to improvise within the limits of this piano. And I think there was tuning issues top and bottom. He stays in the middle register, and also the sonority of that is very particular. And he does an improvisation which then goes on to be the most successful and biggest selling solo piano recording ever. So there's something about this Köln Concert. Now, for me personally, the first solo piano album that I heard by Jarrett, and he has since gone on to make many, was an album called Concerts. And when I heard Concerts for the first time, which I had on cassette tape in the 1980s, when I first heard it, it had a profound effect on me. I was taken away by this album, right? And I went out and got some other solo piano albums, which we're going to talk about in a bit, and I was absolutely bowled over. I don't personally think there's anything particularly special about the Köln Concert, except that the type of improvisation he did was more accessible, because I think it's got repetitious motifs, and it's got this gospel fusion approach that he's explored all the way before. And this gospel fusion approach is very it's very easy to listen to, it's easy to follow. I think Jarrett communicated something, so in a way Köln Concert is massively popular because it's slightly simpler, But he pursues these ideas on other albums. I would say that any of the solo jazz piano albums could be in this spot, right? I have another solo jazz piano album coming up in a minute, which is the one I'm going to really talk about as my favourite solo jazz piano. But it could be any of these albums. But I think if you're coming to Jarrett, you have to get your head around the Köln Concert and the place that occupies in the canon, right? So the reason why I pulled this forward, because I want to make the point that this sold something like 4 million copies sold of an album that was basically a recorder and a couple of mics plugged in on a live concert. This is not cost, you know, what Thriller cost or Dark Side of the Moon cost, you know. So the profits must have been huge for this label. And it allows Jarrett to really explore some strange things that I really want to get onto on this video. He is now Europe focused. And along with the American Quartet, he now forms the European Quartet. And I now have to pull out an album to represent that quartet. And it was a lot easier to do that for me. For me, it's this masterpiece, Belonging. So the American Quartet is obviously Jarrett on piano, Jan Garbrick on a keyboard, on keyboards, on alto saxophone, Paul Danielson is on bass, and John Christensen on drums. These are Jarrett compositions in a lot of cases. It's pursuing the same area of music that the American Quartet is, but the American Quartet is earthier, and its exploration of free improvisation is a lot more rooted in American free improvisation. European free improvisation has a much more sort of conservatoire sound to it. You know, Jan Garbrick's an interesting musician because he really comes out of free jazz. He's really come out of almost like the Albert Ayler school, but he's slowly, his approach becomes more and more concise until in the end he makes an album for ECM with the Hilliard Ensemble, which is an album of Gregorian chants, which again is his multi-million selling pound album. And he's another artist that has been able to find a way of taking free jazz and boiling it down to something that's really, really commercial. You know, it has happened. It has happened. It's deserving of another video, that subject's. The thing I love about this album and Expectations, these are fusion albums. I think at the time, the big thing about fusion that was upsetting the critics was the use of electricity. This is the same thing like when drum machines emerged in the 1980s and people didn't think that was proper music if it had a drum machine on it and all that type of stuff. I think that snobbery existed in the 1970s, and with fusion musicians playing electric instruments, the jazz sort of critical elite didn't like that. So these albums gets considered to be more jazz albums, but they're not. They're out and out fusion albums. They've got rock grooves, they've funk, and when they get to the soloing, there's no changes there. They're modal in many cases, and this is the key to, I think, Jarrett's approach to fusion, is you'll get something really heavy and funky, but when they get to the solos, it's Ornette Coleman's approach to improvisation, which is fueling that way of soloing rather than Coltrane. And I think that's the approach that then emerges in musicians later on, like Pat Metheny and John Schofield. And there's a different approach to fusion improvisation at that point. I think Jarrett, that is his pioneering thing in terms of fusion. This is a masterpiece, one of the great fusion albums. I've talked about it elsewhere. So that's what I've got at number 6 is Belonging, right? The next albums I've got on my list, because we're going to get into some of the weirder stuff now, is an album which is, I think, is my favourite Keith Jarrett album. I bought it many years ago. I think the first album I actually heard by Jarrett would have been that Solo Concerts album, which was on cassette. I recorded it. My mate recorded it for me in the 80s. And I really liked the solo piano. So I went and bought what I thought was a solo jazz piano album, which is called Invocations, The Moth and the Flame. And I would love to hold my album up now. and I have searched high and low, and I can't find it. A lot of the albums that are absolutely my favourite albums, I can't find. Because I played them. This is an album I carried with me all the time. This is one of my favourite albums. Invocations, Moth and the Flame is an album on ECM Records. It's a double album. The Moth and the Flame is a series of studio recorded piano improvisations. They always sounded pretty prepared to me. The reason I like this album so much is, unlike, say, a live improvised album where you pretty much get a whole improvisation on the whole of side one and a whole improvisation on side two, this is a little bit more bite-sized, and because of that you could hear Jarrett almost exploring all sorts of different aspects of music. You could hear him exploring that gospel approach to improvisation, which I call the Keith Jarrett fusion approach. You could hear him looking at space and sound, pure noise, free improvisation, ambience. All that is covered on this track, and this is the solo improvised piano album for me, is Moth and the Flame. But the first disc is a collection of improvisations on a cathedral organ, and this has to be heard to be believed. And the thing that's brilliant about this, I'm sure if somebody sits down and plays a huge church organ, there's going to be a drive to sound a certain way, to be in the tradition of organ music. And Jarrett explores that at certain points, but at certain points doesn't at all, and he coaxes sounds out of that instrument that are absolutely almost like alien at times. Some of it is there's a track, I think it's called Power. I haven't got the album here to hold, but there's a track called Power, and it's almost like heavy metal organ playing. It's absolutely incredible, and it's just also it's like Lamonte Young. It's just huge slabs of continual sound. It's minimal, but it's maximal. This is the album. This was my Jarrett album for me when I was a teenager, where all my mates were coming home and putting on Dire Straits or The Cure. I was putting on Invocations by Keith Jarrett. It was my album. I absolutely loved this album. And the reason why I wanted to put on my list of 10 albums that really represent him is that it's a great solo piano album, but it also represents all the weird stuff he's done. He's recorded albums of improvised harpsichord, which is absolutely incredible. A credible album, which I think is called Book of Ways. There's a whole bunch of weird stuff that I think he got away with because he'd sold 4 million albums for the record label. So they were like, well, you sold 4 million albums making an improvised jazz piano album on a little baby grand that was out of tune. Maybe we just never know with you, Keith, what you might come up with. And for me, as a youngster, hearing Invocations and hearing improvised church organ, that just blew me away. It should have been another Köln Concert, and I'm sure it sold pretty well. Because Jarrett did sell well. He's sold millions of albums, making some of the most uncompromising music around. So, all this weirdness that he's got up to, I have to put an album in, which I've now got at number 8. Which would represent this weirdness. And it's an album that I do not own. It's an album I only discovered recently. And I was going to put another album in here, and I decided last minute to change it for this one. So the album I was going to put in was Restoration Ruin. And that would have gone quite early on, because Restoration Ruin is actually Keith Jarrett's second solo album. And it's an absolutely an anomaly in his catalogue. And it really represents how weird he can get, because Restoration Ruin is an album with him playing all the instruments, guitar, bass, drums, keyboards, percussion, and it's him being you're not going to believe this if you haven't heard the album, it's his singer-songwriter album. He's singing on it, it's in a folk rock style, very influenced by what Dylan's doing in the 60s. It's not a jazz album, it's a singer-songwriting folk album where he's playing all the instruments. Is he a great singer-songwriter? He's okay. It's impressive to hear him play guitar, bass and drums and all that stuff, because you could see how important rock music is to him and how important jazz fusion is. So I was going to put that on the list, and then researching that, I found that in the late 80s, he recorded an album called No End. And this was made in his sort of, I think, in his little studio at home, which was basically 2 cassette recorders and a mixing desk, and he would bounce the recording back and forth overdubbing. He made an incredible album of sort of world music called Spirits, where he doesn't play the piano, he's playing flutes and percussion. And this is an incredible album. And that album was nearly at this point. But the one I'm putting forward is No End. And on No End, he's basically playing drums, electric bass, percussion, and electric guitar. And he's creating these grooves on cassette, bouncing them back and forwards, and then improvising over the top of them in a sort of cut down guerrilla version of On the Corner by Miles Davis. It's out and out jazz fusion, but it's such a strange twisted jazz fusion, and it's so archaic. I mean, this is ECM Records, but when you put the album on, the first thing is you hear is all the hiss that has been built up by bouncing these tracks across cassette recorder. It's absolutely inspiring and incredible. What's Jarrett's guitar playing is, I think, is pretty impressive. The few write-ups I've been able to find on this album, they've said, you know, it shows up his limits as a guitar player. Yeah, compared to his piano playing or even his saxophone playing, he's nowhere near in that league. But you could tell he can play. And what you hear is Jarrett's incredible improvisatory chops. You know, so you're hearing an absolutely virtuoso improviser dealing with the limits of his technique on a guitar within the tradition of rock guitar playing. This is such a unique album. Well worth checking out. You won't find it on YouTube, but it is on Spotify. So I'm sure all the Jarrett fans will be going, what? Go and check that out. So we've just got 2 albums left now to look at, and I have to look at his trio that he forms in the 80s with his old friend from the Charles Lloyd band, Jack DeJohnette, and the great Gary Peacock on bass. This trio is one of the most important jazz groups in the last 40 years. With this group, Jarrett is exploring 2 areas. He's gone back to the jazz standard, and he's exploring the limits with that. And it really is 3 of the greatest musicians in the world at that time, exploring the jazz standard at the highest level. So I need an album to represent that on this list. But they're also exploring free jazz as well, free improvisation. So the album I've pulled out from my collection, and I have nowhere near got them all, but I think this is amongst one of the best in terms of him performing jazz standards, is this live album called Tokyo 96. He's playing really well on this. If you really look into this, that ECM style sometimes hobbles some of these trio recordings. And I've done a little bit of research into this, and it seems that some of them are better recorded than others. There's sometimes the panning is strange on these albums, and sometimes they are. And I felt this with because I really should have gone for Standards Volume 1 or 2, which are the classic albums of the 80s, but I just think they just hobbled a little bit by the ECM dripping in reverb style that was, Manfred Geiger's sort of aesthetic choice at that time. So I've gone with this album. It's a live album, and what I love about this, that some albums you'll get loads of real ballads, some albums you'll get some real fiery tunes. On this you get all of that. So you've got things like Never Let Me Go, which is absolutely beautiful, and you've also got them playing Bebop Billy's Bounce. You know, they do Mona Lisa, Autumn Leaves, My Funny Valentine, and there's also a little bit of free improvisation on here. If I'm just going to check this, I think this Tokyo 96, if you want to hear it, is a good one. Yeah, there's one original called Song. And I think that could well be an improvisation by Keith Jarrett. I'm not so sure. But if you want to hear the trio playing jazz standards, that's the album to go for. There's a whole bunch of... there's a whole bunch. There's Changeless, which explores the improvised aspects of this band. There's a few others, but the one to go for is this absolute masterpiece, Inside Out. This is an album of all their sort of free improvisation off a certain tour that, well, actually, I can't believe it. This is just pulled from 2 nights at the Royal Festival Hall back in 2000. I was listening to this the other day and I thought they must have recorded so many concerts to be able to pull this material, but yeah, just 2 nights. This really, this is a great introduction to free jazz. Free jazz is difficult for people. Anyone coming to free jazz with the 50s free jazz artists, Coltrane, Albert Ayler, Ornette Coleman, there is a spiritual and political aspect to that music. And a lot of times with free jazz, they are really exploring the construction of music. And with a lot of 60s free jazz, it's exploring the limits of that. But there's another way of approaching free jazz, which I think emerges later on and has actually developed within the European tradition of free jazz, which is we're free, we can do whatever we want. If we want to play time, we will. If we want to play harmony, we will. If we want to play something funky, we will. But the fact is, it's free. We are just improvising and we're seeing where the music goes. I think that approach to free jazz really has its roots in the Miles Davis Quintet with its sort of time, no changes. But of course, with the Miles Davis Quintet, it's not always that there is time and no changes. Sometimes there's changes and no time. It's a lot more about, saying, where's this music going? Let's take our intention out of it. And the intention is composition. That's what composition is. Where does it want to go itself? And let's see where it wants to go. This is a brilliant example of that, if I hold the right way around. This is a brilliant example of that. And that is my number 10 on my exploration of the genius of Keith Jarrett. Wrapping up, Keith Jarrett combines a high level of virtuosity with a high number of influences, which I believe makes him a true fusion musician. He employs rock music, he employs pop music, he employs gospel music, he'll put reggae in there if he needs to, soul, R&B, free jazz, classical, avant-garde, minimalism. I can't think of a musician that has pulled and welcomed so much stuff into the fold, and it's all put through improvisation and all through the framing of this in an acoustic context. I think that's Jarrett's great achievement as a musician. There's a lovely quote that I've heard that when he did some classical concerts with Chick Corea, and when Chick Corea heard that Keith Jarrett wanted to work with him, Chick Corea's reply was, well, I better do some practice then. Chick Corea felt he needed to do some practice, which gives you an idea of the level of the musicianship of this guy. Now, that sort of extreme virtuosity mixed with extreme personal expression is the bookends of 2 things which I think make music great. And I think Jarrett has them in complete balance. He's an utter virtuoso. And when you hear his lines, you can hear the influence that his piano playing has had on Alan Holdsworth. You want to know where Alan Holdsworth's lines are coming from? I believe they're coming from Keith Jarrett. I hear a similarity. It's that sort of virtuoso approach. But the virtuosity is kept in check because he is so is the word respectful, or is it mindful of what music is and the way that improvisation, which I believe improvisation and music, the 2 things are interchangeable. I really believe that. And I don't think improvisation in Western culture has been given its deserved place, especially in music. And Jarrett has explored that more than any musician. He's been able to package all of that up in an image which has been sold. And this would be my only criticism of Jarrett, is how much of it is showboating. When you watch his performance, it is so animated. if a pianist is going to go out and do a hour and a half solo jazz improvised piano concert, it's a lot easier on the eyes if the guy is doing all this stuff that Jarrett's famous for, and the vocalizations, which seems to get on people's nerves. It's never bothered me in the slightest. And when he talks about music, it's very, very highfalutin talk when you hear Jarrett talk about music. I think he is a musician that was influenced by this guy that we have in the background. You see right in the corner there, he's looking at me. The mystic Gurdjieff is casting his eye over the whole of these proceedings. And if I go right back to that first album, I wasn't going to mention this. If I pull the booklet out, where's the booklet, right? If you look, because we're right at the end of the video, and this is where the esoteric stuff comes in. It either goes silly and funny, or it goes esoteric. This one's going to go esoteric. So those of you who made it this far, I'm now pointing out some interesting stuff for you about Keith Jarrett. Oh, come on. Where is it? There's a photograph here of Keith Jarrett right in the early days, if I can find it, and I'm not going to be able to. Oh, I'm sorry about this. Where is it? I've said it now. I've got to find it, haven't I? I'm not going to be able to find it. No, I can't find it. I can see another photo. This one's the same one. I don't know if you can see. You won't be able to see, but on his belt buckle there, he has the Enneagram, which is the esoteric symbol that combines the law of 3 with the law of 7, the law of the octave. And I think Jarrett's been very influenced by the work and ideas of the mystic Gurdjieff, and I can hear it in his music. He was indulged by Manfred Geiger at one point and actually recorded an album of Gurdjieff's music. It's a solo piano album, and it's a very good representative of Gurdjieff's music. I've got a feeling that, yeah, it's because it's on the back of the album, not in the book. So there's Jarrett standing all there looking very 60s, and if I zoom in here to that belt buckle, here we go. Can you see that? There is the Enneagram on his belt buckle. You probably couldn't see it, but there's the little esoteric telltale signs that I pick up on. And I think that has been a big influence of him. He talks a lot about energy levels and the way those energy levels work, and how they can be destroyed by certain actions and all that type of stuff. And I think there is that aspect to him, which is very interesting. But some people could say is pretentious. Right, so I've tried to be as fair as I can. That would be my sort of criticism. I've got one, but the guy is an absolute genius. He's one of my favourite musicians. Anyway, got to the end of the video. Was that okay? This video I've been worrying about all week. A lot of videos I don't do that much preparation for. This one I have. I've been listening to Jarrett all week. I've been reading about him. I've been looking at other people's top 10s, and there's hardly any top 10s out there. There's one guy that's done the looked at the trio albums, and that was very useful. I might put that in a link down below. He's only had a few views as well, so you should go and have a look at it. But anyway, yeah, Keith Jarrett, genius, outlier, his own musical world. We finally managed to, have a look at him. I hope I've done him justice. He's a daunting character. I'm sat here thinking, if Keith is watching this, have I done him justice? Probably not. I'm just not clever enough to do it, am I? That's what you feel. It's daunting. If Chick Corea's like intimidated by him, then I'm going to be, aren't I? Keith Jarrett, what a musician. Anyway, there's one more thing I wanted to say. I think around about the 90s, he started to suffer with chronic fatigue syndrome, which curtailed his playing, and he did carry on playing. And then I think a few years back he's had 2 strokes, and Keith's now unable to play the piano. I think his one hand is all right, but the other hand is sort of paralysed, I think. And so it's pretty much that. This is it. It's very weird that an artist that has been so prolific and had such a monumental effect on music He's still alive, and yet we could say this is the catalogue. You know, they may find new recordings, which I'm sure they will. Will we ever hear him do anything else? It's weird, and I've thought about this in preparing this video. When you look at albums like No End, which have been where he's made music under such strange circumstances, you know, why have we not heard the one-handed, restricted piano improvisation album? I suspect it's because the piano occupies such an important place in his being that that's not possible. Who knows? We won't know, because there is this mystery now of what Keith is doing now. And he's probably sitting around having a nice life, listening to lots of music, thinking and enjoying himself. It's done. Sometimes an artist, it's done. I don't know. Anyway, I'm going off into a realm I don't really know what I'm talking about. I'm going to finish there. Hope you like this video, 50 minutes long, God, on Keith Jarrett. If you like. If you want to see some more, subscribe. If you want to become a Patreon and support me, that will be absolutely brilliant. And there's a ton of content over there, and loads of my music and other videos and lots of weird stuff. There's a lot of stuff there, and you know, there's going to be a lot more soon. So I'm done. I'm going to finish. I am going to stop talking right now. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.